right, 1 Kings chapter 11. Let's call this one I Believe, but look at all these women. And the reason why we're saying that is because in this particular set of lessons, it looks like the kings, as they exchange the reign of both Israel and Judah, as the kingdom's going to be divided in this chapter, they're all going to have a unique set of challenges to the fact that they believe in God, and they often believe the things that the prophets are telling them they need to do, but they each have a unique set of distractions that they're going to have to overcome. And this is the famous chapter in which Solomon, as wise as he was, is going to be distracted by all these women. And understanding that this is going to mark a shift in the kingdom, much like in the last set of lessons, we saw David passing the baton on to Solomon. We're going to see Solomon passing the baton on to his sons, and the way that's going to be affected by all the women that Solomon ended up marrying. 700 wives and 300 concubines, otherwise known as, in today's terms, side chicks. But he wasn't just a player. More than once, it's going to say that he literally loved the women that he married or attached himself to. The problem was they were not headed in the same direction that he was, and it was going to present a problem for him later in life. See, because even though he was a wise man, time catches up with everybody, as the athletes will often say. Father Time is undefeated. And just in the same way it's relevant for athletes, it's the same way for wise men, because the same things that we might have been able to balance in our youth, as we get older, it's just not as easy. And even though Solomon was able to probably dazzle and accumulate a large number of women in his youth, the collecting he was going to find was not going to be as the maintenance or the keeping. And so as he got older, the fact that he was partnering with women who God had warned him, they are not headed in the same direction you are, but it caught up to him after he started to decline. So in his later years, they took over, and he left the path of healthy decisions that made him the most successful man on earth in a lot of ways, reminding us of what happened to Samson, the strongest man of his era, who was basically taken down by the famous, or now infamous, Delilah, and the schemes that she put upon him. Schemes that didn't outsmart him as much as they simply overpowered his ability to stand up under the nagging. And so similarly, as Solomon begins to decline, it seems that the voices of his wives get louder and his ability to resist gets lower. And so God is going to intervene, as he will in most of these chapters, directly here with Solomon, but typically through the prophets and the ones that follow. He will let folks know what happens when they decide to pick door number 2 in their set of options. Understanding that even though early in their lives they might believe, yes, I understand what God has said about door number 1, and I love door number 1, real life is going to catch up with them at some point and make door number 2 seem like a much more practical option. And for Solomon, as we said, door number 2 involved a whole variety of women that he fell in love with and had trouble resisting. On the other side of that door, though, were a bunch of enemies he did not necessarily know he had. Why? Because in all his years of peace, he might have forgotten about some of the enemies that were made by his father David, enemies that God subdued for him. Likewise, internally, there were people who probably didn't even know they were Solomon's enemies until they realized, oh, wait a minute, I can be him? And then they began to manifest as well. And so Solomon had enemies to the south in Edom, and to the north, roughly in Syria, and then internally. And they all began to raise their heads, as we said before, when it seems that God removed his hand of protection from Solomon's household. And so one of the lessons that might be a great takeaway from this one might come from another successful man, even though he was probably quite a bit less successful than Solomon, Boaz. We've already talked about him from the book of Ruth. And so Boaz, even though he had to wait a little bit longer in finding a worthy woman who seems to fit his description as being a worthy man, ended up finding someone who he would not have to struggle to please in his later years. And so Boaz, in contrast to Solomon, seems to have a level of peace in his later years with Ruth than Solomon did as the wisest man on earth, surrounding himself with a bunch of women that he loved, but were not on the same page with the things he needed to do to remain successful.